Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Preston Playhouse. For one night only, please put your hands together and welcome your host for the evening, Rebecca Chesney.
Okay, art and class. Is everyone welcome? Thanks for coming here to the beautiful Preston Playhouse. You'll agree it's a beautiful venue. This event is part of the Into a Better Shape programme devised by Labena Himid and produced by Jackie Jones. And I'd also like to thank Liam and Dec here at the Playhouse for all their help and support setting it up. I might just do that. Is it doing it? Here we go. Tonight, I mainly want to focus on the visual arts. The arts are a broad subject, as you know, with each section facing slightly different challenges. However, I think some of the issues are common throughout the sector, so I hope you all find it useful. There will be time at the end of the presentations for questions, or if you want to add or disagree with anything. With respect to the speakers, please can you now put your phones to silent. The event is being filmed and will be posted online. Plus, we have commissioned writer Denise Koku, is that how I say your name? To write a piece about the evening, and that too will be posted online in the future. So please look out for that. I think we have all your emails. If you don't mind, we could then send you links. Tell us if you'd prefer us not to. I want to show you something actually before we start. Something I've noticed and that really bothers me. I didn't know quite where to put these images in the presentation, so I just thought we'd start with them. This is how and who the BBC get to present their programmes on fine art. That's frightening. I think that's a really frightening image. Don't have nightmares. Of course, there's loads of different ways we access information, but this is mainstream. The total number of licences in the UK for 2017-18 was 25,836,495. So what do these images say about who the arts are for? And I looked up all of them, and they're all sort of Oxford, Cambridge educated. Nothing wrong with that, obviously, but it's not very diverse. I'm a visual artist. We might turn that off because it might be put you off. There's very little known fact that actually Fiona Bruce is from Blackpool. And I spent years trying to get rid of her accent. That's not true, by the way. It's only true now, it's only funny now that you know it's not true. Okay. I'm a visual artist based here in Preston. Last year I organised an event similar to this about the underrepresentation of women in public art collections. And at the end of the event I joked and said the next thing I want to look at is art and class. And quite a few people came up to me and said, you should do that. So I thought, I'll do that. But it's been so hard to know what I want to say. Class is such a difficult subject to tackle, isn't it? It just is. We've all had different life experiences. And class in connection to the arts is really difficult to pick apart and confusing. Somebody said to me last week that just by being in the arts, you're middle class. And I've heard that a few times. I understand why she said it. The arts can be exclusive. Feels like middle-class stuff made by and for middle-class audiences. And I think, like those BBC images, sort of help to perpetuate that notion. I also suspect that most of us here have stepped into a gallery or museum at some point in our lives and had that horrible, awkward feeling of, I don't belong here. But I really hate this assumption, this perception of the arts, and I'll tell you why. There are masses of artists, makers, creative thinkers, curators, dancers, musicians, writers, actors, the list could go on, from working class backgrounds working in the arts. And wonderful projects in and from working class areas. But it's so much harder for them to survive when the rules are aimed at and in favour of the middle class. It's not a fair game. The longer we let this image of the arts continue, the more of an exclusive club it will become. And at a time when art subjects are being cut in the national curriculum, what message are we sending out to the next generation of creative thinkers and artists? I'm in a profession that keeps telling me that if I'm good enough and work hard enough, I'll get to wherever it is I want to be. Although from where I'm standing, it looks like it would also help if you've been educated at one of a certain few establishments, got financial security, and have or are connected to those with social influence. I've been around long enough to know that my background has had an impact on some of the things I've achieved as an artist or not, the opportunities open to me or not, and even the methods and materials I use. However, it's difficult to pinpoint exact moments or recognise specific barriers I've faced. We all operate and exist within this system and don't have the benefit of viewing it from afar. I want to talk a little bit about money. While not exclusively, or it's not exclusive to any particular class. You can have lots of money and be working class. And we've all heard middle class people moan about being skint. Even the Queen doesn't manage without millions of pounds of taxpayers' money to get by. So even the Queen doesn't get by without lots of handouts. Money is an issue when you're a working class artist or arts professional trying to earn a living. Working for nothing or very low pay is common in this industry. I'd like to suggest that galleries and museums not willing to pay decent wages for their staff or rates of pay to artists are essentially discriminating against the working class. And this is just not acceptable. We need to start paying fairly at every level, so that's entry level almost particularly. Why does this all matter? Art is an expression of the human imagination. It's about storytelling, sharing and revealing what it is to be human. When we don't include everyone from all backgrounds, we are not hearing the whole story. Listening to everyone might actually be a little bit uncomfortable at times, but it is essential if we want the arts to be truly open to all and an honest reflection of society. In my quest to pick apart the intricacies of this topic, I've invited the speakers tonight to add to the discussion and give us thoughts from their own perspective. So, this is British class in the 21st century. You can go online and sort of fill out a few questions and it'll tell you what class you're in. So maybe, yeah. I'm in the new affluent worker section. I'm quite pleased about that. Okay. Okay, so let's get on. The first speaker tonight is David O'Brien. He is Chancellor's Fellow in Culture and Creative Industries, based in the School of History of Art at the University of Edinburgh. He is the author of Cultural Policy, Management, Value and Modernity in the Creative Industries, and was Parliamentary Academic Fellow in 2018, working with the House of Commons Digital Culture, Media and Sports Committee. He was lead investigator on Who is Missing from the Picture, an AHRC-funded creative economy project that published the Panic Report on inequality in culture, cultural and creative jobs, audiences and wider British society. And if you haven't read the Panic Report, you really, really should read it. I'm presuming a lot of you have though already. Okay, so please welcome the first speaker, David O'Brien.
Thanks for inviting me to talk about some of the work myself and my colleagues have been doing. Just actually, as Rebecca mentioned, as a kind of spoiler alert, I'm going to be talking about the Panic Report. So if you've read that, you can probably sort of put your feet up for 15 minutes, have a bit of a snooze. So I'm also going to be talking about some of the issues that have come up as myself and my co-authors have followed up the Panic Report as well. And I thought I'd start with this quote. As part of working with Create an Arts Emergency and also on this AHRC funded project, we did a lot of follow-up interviews to some survey work. We did just over 230 interviews with creative workers. And we're currently working on a book to try and delve into some of the issues that the interviews raised. And I thought I'd start actually with some of that data. So it's been anonymized and it's not attributable. So we've given Liz a pseudonym here. She was in her 30s when we interviewed her about 18 months ago. Black British woman, curator, artist, writer, doing one of those kind of like multiple artistic careers that involved lots of different roles. And it struck us that she told us a story that was quite kind of jarring and I guess kind of quite opposed to how many arts institutions like to think about themselves. So she was quite open actually about, the first time I went into a contemporary gallery, I was 17, I walked in the door, I was made to feel like a piece of shit. Really, it was disgusting the way that people behaved towards me. And then later she went on to kind of describe how she found this, as a kind of challenge, that she was going to sort of challenge how the art world functioned and how it had made her feel. But crucially, she also said that this challenge, living a life that she described as unprecedented, I didn't know anyone else who was doing it. I'd have to find a way to be comfortable in any room I was in. And this kind of summed up actually a lot of the issues that we found working on some of the quantitative data that underpin the Panic Report, that there are definitely exclusions both in terms of occupations and in terms of consumption habits around artistic and cultural institutions and art forms. But moreover, actually there are, I guess, kind of particular challenges that people often have to kind of internalize, and they internalize these challenges, to sort of overturn the structures of the art world or cultural production that they encounter in contexts where they have very little resources. As Liz mentioned, I didn't know anyone else who was doing it. And this is set against people who have much more straightforward paths into cultural production, into cultural and creative jobs, because they know lots of people who are doing these kind of careers. They feel at home in institutions. They are never ever made to feel like they're a piece of shit, and they're never ever, kind of disgusted by the treatment they face from the institution. This hopefully kind of leads into a quick summary of some of the issues we found across consumption and production in the UK at the moment. And we published this a year ago to the day. Actually, I didn't realise it had been a year to the day, but my colleagues at Create reminded me this morning. So Panic, It's an Arts Emergency is the sort of brand Create an arts emergency we're kind of keen on using, and we published this report subtitled Social Class, Taste and Inequalities in the Creative Industries. And I'll just sort of take you through some of the findings. I should add, what sort of depresses me about these findings is that, academically speaking, these aren't particularly interesting. As an academic, you should never say your work is not interesting. That, is a bit risky, but basically, everything I'm going to tell you is well settled in the academic literature on both cultural production and cultural consumption. As we were kind of compiling the data, usually from secondary data sources, we didn't find anything that kind of shocked us or surprised us. But my interactions with various bits of, whether it's the visual arts, the film industry, contemporary theatre, whether it's the music industry, or whether it's, individual, say, art critics, artists, through things like Twitter, and for my colleagues through Facebook, people still seem surprised at some of the things that we as academics think are just the way the system works. So, for example, if we start with how kind of arts funding works in England. My colleague Mark Taylor, who's one of the co-authors, did some work looking at Arts Council England data that suggested that there's a real skew in terms of whose tastes are legitimised by funding. So as he notes in one of his papers that we used in the report, the wealthiest, best educated, least ethnically diverse 8% of the population are the most culturally active segments. There are questions about how you measure cultural activity, and I'll talk a little bit about them. This is based on attendance, on kind of going to stuff, usually at institutions, and their cultural tastes are subsidised quite heavily, £84 per person in terms of theatre, £94 per person in terms of music. This music, for example, is talking about contemporary classical music, about jazz, about opera. It's not talking about, say, pop music, heavy metal or grime music, which are not generally the subjects of Arts Council funding. And these patterns can be found across a range of different art forms. So this is English data. What we can see is that opera, only about 4% of the population, when asked, say that they've been to an opera once in the last year. Classical music, 8% of the population. Contemporary dance, 3%. Art exhibitions, which might be of interest, particularly here, it's less than a fifth of the population. In many ways, what we'd think of as kind of sort of legitimate culture, if I can use that term, the kind of culture that the state is comfortable funding, is very much a minority pastime. And indeed, this is in response to a question that is, have you been once in the last year? So this isn't even kind of, people who are sort of saying they're doing it regularly. And I'll show you in subsequent slides how small a percentage of the English population that is. Film is the only outlier where you get a majority of the population saying they've been to see a film at least once in the last year. And there is, a sort of significant minority, more actually than are going to art exhibitions, for example, that say they don't attend any cultural activities at all. Now, crucially, I really want to sort of reinforce the point that this doesn't mean that this segment of the population are not doing art and culture, but rather the kinds of what my colleagues refer to as everyday activities, everyday participation that they're interested in is not captured by the English state system of cultural production and cultural consumption. I'll just drill into this a little bit more for you, but I'll have to stick to time actually. So this is a visualization of who does what in England, and the two axes hopefully should be reasonably kind of clear. You have people who are attending lots of things, often, etc., towards the other side of the visualization, and then people who are like not attending stuff. Towards the side that I'm standing on. In the data, when we were looking at it, it sort of clusters together in two different ways. We just use these terms as our kind of shorthand. People are interested in maybe more classical forms of cultural activity, so things like opera, ballet, and then more contemporary forms like going to video art exhibitions, contemporary dance, this kind of stuff. What we find in the kind of classical side and people who are kind of attending more is that particular cultural pastimes cluster together. So people who are going to the opera are likely to be going to the ballet, are likely to be going to classical music. But there's a kind of a big range of people who are not doing stuff. So not doing stuff tends to cluster together. So people who aren't doing things like going to the carnival, if they're not going to the carnival, they're probably not going to see films, and they're probably not attending the ballet either. Now, this is the kind of like vanilla public version of this visualization. The hardcore academic visualization is this. If you kind of keep in mind that spatial relationship kind of people doing lots of classical things in the minority in the top corner, the majority of people not doing stuff clustered towards the side I'm on. When we layer over different occupations, what we find is that people who are doing what we might think of as kind of working class occupations, so routine manual occupations, are very much in the space of not doing stuff. So not attending a carnival, not going to see films, not going to the ballet. Even people who are doing kind of elite occupations, higher managerial occupations, people who are senior managers, lawyers, doctors, the kind of like classic middle class in England, they're not actually doing all that much stuff either. The real kind of outliers are people who make culture. So people who are working in artistic and literary occupations, people who are working in media occupations, there are big kind of outliers in terms of who does what. In England, in cultural terms. But for the majority of the population, like not doing stuff is normal, not going to the theatre, not going to the art gallery, not going to the carnival. That is like the norm of cultural consumption in England. The government's data suggests somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the population do one cultural thing, at least one cultural thing a year, which gives the impression that culture is a kind of like national pastime, at least for the English population. But actually, when you get into it, that really isn't true. And we should think actually of like not doing stuff as being the norm for culture in England. Okay, so I've got sort of maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes left. The other side to this is who is working in the kind of occupations that are producing culture and are most likely to be most heavily culturally engaged. So this is data from the Office for National Statistics Labour Force Survey. This was data from 2014. We did the same work in 2015. We've also been working with census data that suggests these patterns are basically kind of not changing and are fairly static. If we look at ethnicity, what we can see is that museums, galleries, libraries, film, TV, radio, music, performing, visual arts have really big problems in terms of underrepresentation of those from ethnic minorities. So in the museums, galleries, libraries sector, it is dominated by white people. You're getting on for 93% of this workforce is white, which is, a kind of a crucial problem if these institutions are supposed to be kind of representative of the nation. It's also a really serious problem depending on geography. So places like London, Birmingham, the major northern cities have, kind of different ethnic mix compared to the rest of England. So this imbalance is much more crucial in urban settings. Class, about a third or so of the population, according to the Labour Force survey, are from working class social origins. I can sort of give you technical discussions about that later. But what we can see is that third of the population is certainly underrepresented in publishing, in film, TV, radio, in music, performing and visual arts. And all of these underrepresentations in class origin terms are mirrored by over-representations of those from middle-class starting points. So when you drill down into publishing, if you look in particular at authors, writers, that's getting on for 50% of those occupations are from middle-class origins, are from parents who are doctors, lawyers, CEOs, these kinds of things. It's about 14% or so of the population are from those middle-class origins. So for all of these underrepresentations in class terms, there are often overrepresentations of middle-class origin people. Gender, similar kind of issues around underrepresentations of women in film, TV and radio. One thing that interests us is museums, galleries and libraries, which seems to have a kind of a much better gender balance, which seems to be one of the cultural occupations, along with publishing, that doesn't have really kind of serious exclusions of women. But we know that this, as a workforce, is not representative of who runs museums and libraries and galleries, that the kind of top end of these professions, the people kind of running the institutions, tend to be men. They don't tend to reflect the patterns in the workforce overall. I'll skip that. Now, we were very interested in kind of explaining some of these patterns and thinking about the structures that underpin these patterns when we were writing the report. So this is from web survey data. We were lucky enough to have about 2,500 respondents to a kind of standard survey instrument we used, looking at a variety of different things in cultural and creative work. This is responses to who do you know? What's your kind of social network, your friendship group like? And what we found was that, and this was kind of unsurprising to us, our creative workers said they tended to know other creative workers. They tended to know artists, graphic designers, actors, web designers, which is completely sort of reasonable considering that these jobs are heavily network-based. You know, who you know is crucial to getting work. But this came seemingly at the cost of knowing what we might think of as working class occupations, bus drivers, people who work for the post office, people who work in factories, people who are electricians, people who do kind of secretarial or clerical work. And crucially, this raises questions about both the kind of representativeness of our cultural workforce. You know, they just don't know many of the people doing the jobs that are kind of like, you know, normal for the bulk of the English population, nor, unfortunately, do they have those kind of broader class mix that you'd expect if I suppose the arts and cultural production system was more representative. What the arts and cultural production system look like is other middle class jobs. They reflect, you know, the kind of friendship patterns that we might expect to see in people who are working in different professions such as doctors, lawyers, etc. Okay, so I've got a couple of minutes left. I'll just highlight a couple more things. This is from British Social Attitudes data, which is a survey that's been running for about 30 years, looking at different, as it says, social attitudes in Britain. We were interested in where our artistic workers would fit on scales in terms of their kind of values. So this is in response to a set of questions that sort of tests or interrogates people's social attitudes, whether they're liberal or whether they're authoritarian. It's questions like, you know, we should always respect politicians, we should always obey the police, you know, strongly agree, strongly disagree, those kind of questions. And what we find is that the arts are the most liberal of any set of occupations. Plumbers and electricians are the most authoritarian. Again, which is stuff we know, we weren't surprised by that in the slightest. Similarly, on the left and right scale, here the arts look more like public service workers. So the arts are kind of closer to people who work in the health service or in educational occupations. But crucially, it tells a story of the arts being the most liberal, the most left-wing. If you look at other scales, so like pro and anti-immigration, attitudes to welfare, broadly speaking attitudes to Brexit, what you find is the story of an arts production system, an arts workforce that is the most liberal, most left-wing, most, you know, kind of pro-welfare, most pro-immigration of any set of occupations, which I think is great. You know, they're my political views. It's brilliant that my values are affected by the workforce, but they are really not the values of Britain. Like, you know, Britain is a pretty authoritarian society in terms of its values, you know, and certainly in terms of voting patterns, the arts don't look anything like the rest of the population, which raises two questions. One, again, a question of representativeness, but also a question of, do you have to have these kinds of values to end up working in the arts? And are these values, you know, a kind of a barrier that stops people getting in, particularly because, and this is quite controversial, but it's backed up by, you know, any form of kind of electoral or attitudinal data you want to find, authoritarian attitudes are more prevalent in those doing routine manual occupations compared to those who, say, work in the education sector. So, you know, there's this kind of question of people who are from routine manual class origins able to get in terms of a values mismatch. And what indeed should we do about this? Do we think it's a problem at all? I'm not entirely sure it is, but I'm, you know, not an artist who's struggling to get in and get on. Finally, and this is another kind of attitudinal question, which raised particular problems for us, and a couple of us did a full paper looking at just this data. In our web survey, which is back to the web survey data, we asked people their attitudes to kind of getting in and getting on in their occupation? This is a standard question that gets asked in American social surveys about kind of societal fairness and attitudes to meritocracy in society. We tweaked it slightly to look at just occupational fairness. And we asked people if getting in, getting on, their kind of success was explained by their family background, by being educated, having, ambition, hard work, or whether it was to do with their class, their gender, their ethnic group. We split these roughly into meritocracy, which is the people who were telling us that it was about basically kind of working hard, being ambitious, being talented. And then what we call social reproduction, which is where people would tell us it's about your ethnicity, your class, your gender. Essentially the kind of social inequalities we see in society are being reproduced by the cultural sector. So this is a visualization of every single one of our just under 2,500 responses. And what we can see is that all of the responses are kind of, trending towards the top corner, which is where people were more likely to say meritocracy was the crucial explanation. Very few people told us social reproduction was what explained success in cultural and creative occupations. Now, again, this is logical. If you enter the art world, the film industry, the theatre industry, thinking that it's completely stacked against you, have the right class background, then there's kind of no chance of you making it. You probably wouldn't try and work in those industries. And so it's kind of logical that everybody has, some attachment to the idea that hard work and talent will be rewarded eventually. But what we saw was that the people who were most likely to say hard work and talent were the explanations, the people who were most likely to be attached to meritocracy were the best paid of our survey respondents, suggesting a real problem. That the people who have been most successful, at least in pay terms, the people who are likely to be running institutions, to be making decisions, particularly hiring decisions or commissioning decisions, were least likely to see the problems of barriers based on class, race, gender, the kind of big social inequalities that we might think about. And unfortunately, that suggests that the system is unlikely to change. If we have a system where everybody is bought in a bit in terms of thinking hard work and talent will be rewarded, but the people at the top are most attached to that belief, then it's hard to see where change is going to come from. And I sort of leave it over to the other panelists to think about maybe in their work, sort of strategies for change. Because as a sort of social scientist studying this stuff, I'm pretty pessimistic. Thank you.
Our second speaker tonight is Marlene Smith. Marlene Smith is an artist who curates. She joined the Black Art Group in 1982 and exhibited widely during the 1980s. She's been director of WEMAS in Birmingham and the Black Art Gallery in London, worked at the African and Asian Visual Artists Archive and led the Public Gallery in West Bromwich. She is an associate artist at Modern Art Oxford and also works with artist Labena Hamid and curator Christine Ayene at the Making History's Visible Archive, based here at UCLan in Preston, where she is also a PhD candidate at IBAR, which is the Institute for Black Atlantic Research. So please welcome Marlene.
Right, so it's really interesting for me to be following our previous speaker because a lot of what has been said statistically, I'm going to kind of reflect through a kind of personal reflection of my career and where I am and how that relates to class, or at least that's what I'm going to try to do. So what you're going to have is, from my presentation, is a sort of personal journey. And we're going to do a bit of travelling in time back and forth because I get bored with just doing the chronology. So we're going to go back and forth a bit. Okay. So I'm going to start here. So some of my colleagues have been saying to me recently that they're a bit sick of being referred to as children of Windrush. But for me, that's not the case at all. And I'm currently, in the work that I'm making, kind of contemplating what Windrush means to me personally, and kind of I'm doing that a lot by looking at particular images from my family album. And in the work that I've been doing since the 1980s up until today, particular images from that family album reoccur. And this is one of my favourites. And it's been a pop-up book, and it's been all kinds of things. So anybody that's from the Midlands will know that Weston-super-Mare and Rhyl are the two destinations that you go to for a day trip, because we're a bit landlocked in the Midlands. And I'm hoping that by showing you this 1973 image, you'll understand that the two coloured girls in the cardigans are the children of migrants that arrived in the UK in the 1950s. And on this particular day trip to Weston, the photographer is my mother. And she would have been in the UK from 1956. So she's taking the photograph of her two little girls. But when I look at this image, what I also see in that image, and what I reflect on, is who's welcome and who's not welcome. And I reflect on how it felt to be on a day trip to Weston-super-Mare in 1973. Yeah. I absolutely love this image. I love the, sorry, I'm walking away from the microphone. Can I do this? I threatened to do it earlier. Paul, you can tell I'm not used to using a microphone. I love these firemen. I love that this little boy in the blue is looking not at me and my sister, and if you haven't recognised me, I'm the one in the pink cardigan. But I think he's looking at my mother. And I love that the gentleman in the far left is also looking. But as you can see, even though we're on the beach and there's probably been some donkey rides happening, there's not a lot of smiling going on. So there's a kind of tension in Weston in 1973. And so when I'm looking at these images now, I'm reflecting on a number of things. So my statistics are not really anywhere near as elegant as the ones you saw earlier. I'm thinking that between 1973 and 1958, that's 15 years. And then my mother, who is now 83, is suffering from Alzheimer's. She lives in a retirement village. We'll come on to that in a minute. And I'm thinking that in 15 years, she would have been nursing as she did. She worked with, in the National Health Service with people who were suffering from, what did they call it then? They called it geriatrics, that's what she did. She worked with geriatrics, and most of her patients weren't Windrushers. She worked nights. And she'd also have been sending her 4 children to school, and she would have gone to 10 years' worth of parents' evenings. In those days, we did have parents' evenings about once a term, and there were 4 children, so I don't know how many that is, but it's quite a lot. And by 1973, her eldest child would have been just about the age where you have to start worrying about stop and search if you've got a brown boy and you're living in the inner city. So those are the kinds of things that kind of come to mind when I look at that family album. So now I'm just going to bring you really far forward to what I'm currently doing, ish. So about 4 years ago, I got involved in a project called Black Artists and Modernism. And there was a film that came out in the middle of last year, which looked at the history of black artists in the UK, kind of. It was a bit, it's a lot of history for like 60 minutes on the BBC, but, it kind of gave a roundup of the kinds of activities that black artists have been doing. And it started, it focused on artists in the post-war kind of period, but there was a concentration of artists that would have been actually my parents' generation, that would have come over not as migrants to work in the NHS, but as kind of middle-class Caribbeans who came to be educated here. And then there's my generation, which were really, a kind of phenomenon of black, British-born or educated people who went to art college in a kind of massive way that hadn't happened before. And the impact of that, I think, was the Black Arts Movement, which is referred to in this documentary. So I guess what I'm saying to you is that in between, see, I've got myself into trouble now. In between 1973 and 2017, I'd taken steps to become an artist. I'm just going to whiz through some of these because this is just kind of evidence of what I'm doing now. In 1982, I joined a group of other black art students who came together to show our work, to kind of discuss our existence, our relationship to the UK, to being black and British, to a history of empire and colonialism and all that kind of stuff. I wanted to talk a little bit about that thing about being welcome and being unwelcome. The slide that we saw just earlier about the meritocracy and about how people become artists because their work is good or not good, really resonates with me because in my career as a student activist and organizer of exhibitions and things and other types of activism, up until today when I'm often working with young artists and art students of colour, I'm constantly hearing the same types of stories about about a kind of precarious existence, about being invisible and unwelcome, or about being over-visible and racialized. Now, some of you might be thinking that that's got nothing to do with class. And I do find myself struggling to speak specifically about class and to detach that from other parts of my identity, because I've never experienced class in absence of race and gender. But I do look at this image of members of the Black Art Group and Sonia Boyce, and I think about what our socio-economic backgrounds were. And if I run through those artists, Claudette Johnson, Donald Rodney, Keith Piper, myself at the top in the brown jacket, and Sonia Boyce at the front, all of us came from migrant parents, and those migrant parents didn't come here to go to university, they came here to work in the NHS, in the lower echelons of the NHS, in the laundry and, as the auxiliary nurses, and to be cleaners and cooks. And it does strike me that when I look at the work of those artists, it seems to me that those artists were particularly vocal in looking at, in addressing those issues in their work. One of the other things that I found when I was kind of looking back at, not only do I mess about with my own archive, my personal family album, I'm also spending a lot of time with other types of archival material, particularly archival material related to the 1980s and to the Black Arts movement of the 1980s. And I came across this visitor's book. And I'm going to go back again. In 1982, when I was a 16, 17-year-old teenager who was kind of a bit bored and spent too much time in bed on a Saturday morning, this poster arrived. And I went along to the exhibition that it refers to at the Icon Gallery in Birmingham. And so this visitor's book is actually from that same exhibition. And it wasn't until quite recently, when I was looking through some of this material, that I noticed the signature of Monica Ross. I don't know if you can see that, sort of 3 lines down, M. Ross, and she says, succinct, powerful, moving. And some of you will know that Monica Ross was also a working class artist, that she was, her reputation's really built on the work that she did around feminist art in the 1970s. And that in the 1980s, she happened to come along to the Icon Gallery to see this exhibition and was really supportive of that work. And I was reflecting the other day about the kinds of supports and networks that artists like Monica Ross created for artists like myself. And one of the reasons that I was reflecting on that is because when the Black art group and artists of my generation were making noises about race in particular, it wasn't particularly well received in the 1980s. It was seen as unnecessary, nothing to do with the art, ungrateful. Okay. So in 1984, my mother does actually feature quite a lot in my work. In 1985, I should say, not 84, I was invited by Lubena Himid to take part in an exhibition at the ICA in London called The Thin Black Line. And at that time, about 6 months before this exhibition, which opened in October 1985, I'd been on a march in London. And the march was protesting was a protest against what had happened to a Commonwealth migrant from the Caribbean called Cherry Gross. And what had happened is that the police had been looking for her son, had come to her house in the morning, about 7 a.m., searching for this young man, and they'd shot her, and she was paralyzed. And so the image, it's actually not a bad likeness of my mum, although she hated it. And behind her is yet another image from the same family album. And that image is of my little sister's birthday party. So when I look at these images from my family album, sometimes what I see, as well as who's welcome and who isn't welcome, I see the attempts at respectability. And the way that the that my migrant parents attempted to adopt and adapt this kind of social norms of the host nation. That's what I see. My mother probably wouldn't see that at all. She'd just see a lovely party. Okay, I'm just going to take you here. So in 1987, I made this piece of work, which is, in some ways, you see, it brings together, for me, in terms of its content, a lot of the kind of knotty issues that we find so difficult to discuss around the socio-economic and how that impacts on what art is made. I've got 2 more minutes, so I'm just going to tell you very briefly that the vase, which is standing on that shelf, was crocheted by my mum. The hot citrus plastic flowers that are in it are the kinds of flowers that I would have found in my mother's living room and in other living rooms of that kind of ilk at that kind of time, that I would have hated, actually, in 1973, because they were so Caribbean. And the images on the right-hand side, the top right is an astonishing African-American sculptor. She's astonishing because she was born during slavery and went on to have a fabulously successful career as a sculptor. The second image is a self-portrait by an artist called Simone Alexander. The third are the hands of Magdalene Adondo, who is a ceramicist, a potter, and the image is taken by Ingrid Pollard, who is a photographer, and the last is an image by another photographer called Brenda Agard. And I don't know if I need to say to you why it's significant that the thing is called art history, but it's really asking those questions about what art is, where artists come from, and it's this kind of response to 2 essays. One is it's kind of speaking back to a room of one's own, and also speaking to an essay that I was reading at the time, I believe, by Alice Walker, the title of which is In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. I'm going to leave it there because I have run out of time. But I guess if I was going to kind of summarize, I would say that my entire career, I've been really conscious of thresholds, and I'm still conscious of those thresholds and the extent to which I'm not meant to be there. The extent to which spaces have physical thresholds which are not welcoming and which are difficult for certain people to cross. And I've worked in contexts where I'm working with people who can see the threshold and are trying to dissolve it. And that's work that I'm still engaged in. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Marlene. That was really interesting. Interesting, those overlapping issues, I think. And I think that's why class is so complicated, because it's usually not just about one thing at a time. Our next speaker is Rebecca Davis. Rebecca is a social artist with a deeply embedded practice that uses illustration, performance, and event collaboratively and to communicate politics and concerns around issues such as housing injustice and the closure of social spaces. Rebecca advocates for people-led change and works with community members to transform ideas into creative action. Her project, the Oasis Social Club, represented Great Britain during... You see, I'm going to do it in a proper Lancashire accent now. During the Mons Euro Capital of Culture 2015 and toured to Stoke-on-Trent, Preston and Hull. I can do those three. She's from Elephant and Castle in London and moved to Stoke-on-Trent in 2016 to work on the Portland Inn project with Anna Francis and residents of Portland Street and negotiate the community asset transfer of a derelict pub building. So please welcome Rebecca Davis.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I don't need to say the little bit about what I do then. But yeah, I wanted to I'm just going to take you through a few projects that I've been working on. And I wanted to start with where I'm from. So as Rebecca just mentioned, I'm from Elephant and Castle in southeast London. And I spent my whole childhood there and then moved back there in 2009 as someone that could draw and kind of was interested in having an art career, I guess, but was just figuring things out. And so moving back there, I began furiously documenting the Elephant and Castle. Basically, it was kind of earmarked for demolition. So it's kind of a shopping centre surrounded by estates. There's a big roundabout, and there's kind of this constant talk of regeneration going on. And back in 2009, regeneration was quite a new thing, and I was just learning what it meant. So just kind of documenting the area in the shopping centre that hadn't changed since I was a child. There's a lot of market stall holders, small kind of shop traders. It's very ethnically diverse. There's a large Latin American community that live and work there, Bangladeshi community, and it's really a kind of, for me, just felt like the whole city in a really small space. But now it's kind of, this is really what the landscape looks like. So kind of at that time, regeneration was about supposed to be kind of improving an area for the people that live there, and actually swiftly everyone started realising that the area was really becoming something for the sorts of people that you see on the hoardings. I kind of started thinking, well, just these drawings weren't kind of going anywhere, and what was the point in documenting? And I was becoming more interested in chatting with people about what regeneration meant. And I do want to just read a little quote actually, so that I can be a little bit clearer on maybe where I stand as an artist in these kind of community settings as well. So this is a quote from Linton Kwesi Johnson, and it's an opinion that I agree with. I don't believe art changes anything. Art reflects changes within the wider society. Changes come out of people's material struggles in life. What community artists can do within their work is to assist those struggles and to participate in the development of the consciousness that fuels them. So we kind of created a space basically at Elephant and Castle to kind of have these kind of conversations. And I guess the work became about evidencing and making visible the diversity of cultures, skills, networks and resourcefulness present in the area. And so we kind of managed to negotiate this empty shop unit that we used as a residency space for local community organisations that didn't have a space to kind of meet and organise. So in this picture you see the Latin American Women's Rights Services and the Latin American Workers Association that used it as a kind of info shop and a place to meet and make work in. And then we kind of started moving into skill exchanges. This was sort of back in, so basically was working in Elephant for about 10 years on different projects. And this was, the skill exchanges was really about kind of, right, how can we kind of all come together in a space? How do we sort of unite? There are lots of different community groups here that don't necessarily sort of connect. And actually connection in a place that's being earmarked for demolition is really important, because we were learning that in places of development, it's really easy to get a planning application through if a developer just says, well, there's not really a sense of community here, and if there is, it's invisible. So it became about making it really visible. So we as kind of residents, traders as well, other artists and activists sort of became very visible by sort of hosting these skill exchanges, events, parties on the big kind of shop floor. And the beauty of Elephant and Castle Shopping Centre is that it's not like Westfield or these kind of posh shopping centres that you get. It's really, you can just set up and kind of everything's quite ad hoc, and it's quite beautiful actually. So yeah, that kind of moved into I guess kind of representation and the sort of capacity of communities to self-organise, basically. So how do we tool up? How do we learn jargon around development and, you know, what does this mean for us, where we're living, where we're working? And kind of we started working with kind of architects, members of the council, and you know, also try to have these conversations with developers around kind of, you know, who the big players are, this new housing, what does affordable mean? What's luxury living? Can I still live here? And whose responsibility is it anyway? Because everyone's constantly passing the buck. So these kind of playful games were actually at their core about quite serious sort of politics and concerns. And I guess it became, rather than the sort of celebratory kind of atmosphere that it once was, and that was really important and poignant, it became more about resisting, and it got quite serious. So we worked for 3 years on a short film, which you can see online, called Unearthing Elephant, where we, so I collaborate with Eva Sajevitz, who's a Slovenian artist and was also resident, still is, brought up her kids in Elephant and been living there for 20 years. And we've been working together on this film, and it took us 3 years to do 15 minutes because it was really difficult to get right, you know, these politics and this story. But we just knew that this localized narrative was universal, and it had to be kind of heard by people outside of the shopping centre and outside of the borough and online, basically. And that became part of a kind of the political campaign that was kind of objecting to the planning application to demolish the shopping centre. So much around Elephant has kind of been demolished since, but the shopping centre still stands, and so that's kind of continuing. So then kind of always running parallel to the stuff at Elephant was kind of then, you know, this idea of, right, there's these conversations that we're having at Elephant, but this issue is universal. And I was really inspired by some of the women that were displaced. So they were kind of moved out of the estate next door to Elephant called the Haygate. I don't know if you heard about it, but it was quite well reported. But and they, although they sort of moved out to the kind of peripheries of London, they would still come back each week to go to the bingo hall that was at the shopping centre. And I guess I sort of, was kind of started having these conversations with people outside of London, like, how do we come together and why is it not always easy? And so up in Coventry, at my granddad's working men's club, where most of my family are members, this is the Hen Lane, and started kind of having conversations with some of the members there around how did they still come together and what were the issues, sort of in this particular area where my dad was brought up, how this social club was built, right in the middle of 3 mines, and those were all shut. And so kind of just, having these sort of informal conversations, and through that just kind of met these really great guys who introduced me to this project that they started in 1983 called Forward Together. And it was really about celebrating how kind of working men's clubs, in particular Hen Lane, but all of them, weren't just about a pint of lager and a packet of crisps. They were about organising and coming together, and also sort of kind of about skill exchanges as well. So they had like aerobics instructors come in, and this was sort of next to the bar. They were doing like aerobics lessons and various different things. But sadly in 1984 there was the miners' strike, and so kind of this whole really exciting, quite radical program had to get abandoned, obviously, because, the focus point was kind of looking after the families that were getting through that whole year of striking. At the same time, I met this woman called Doreen. Doing the work that I do that's like community context, I started kind of getting commissions from arts organisations and galleries, and I can talk more about that later because I have lots of beefs around community engagement and all of these different things. But Doreen, I just met, we became good friends, and she was a Hackney bar lady for 30 years. Don't take any shit, aren't afraid to hold the local council to account for not clearing up stuff, but also make sure you have a really good time in their presence. So that kind of twinned with being, at my granddad's club, just started thinking about how to mobilise these conversations, and created Mavis Davis with Doreen. So Mavis Davis is based on Doreen. What she looks like, sounds like, smells like was kind of largely up to Doreen and based on her. And then kind of basically started up the Oasis Social Club. So it was really a sort of idea of, right, how do we take these core principles that are really important, this kind of committee, local people sort of representing their area, self-organising, also having a really good time, but exchanging at the same time. But at the same time, it be progressive and welcoming of everybody, not just kind of, because it is like a white working class kind of tradition that's very male dominated as well. Embarked on this process of going on tour to Preston and Stoke-on-Trent and Hull. So this was Denise Braithwaite was created locally, and again, looked like, smelt like, sounded like, was all up to locals. I learnt the accent and everything, believe it or not. And, just this sort of process of kind of creating these characters was quite interesting, because then people owned them, and sort of Barb Forshaw is based on Brenda Proctor, who is a North Staffordshire miner's wife who I work with in Stoke-on-Trent. And that's the club, so it was kind of really literally transparent, and it was kind of designed to be sort of welcoming and very alternative kind of style to the working men's club, but everything kind of based on the Hen Lane Club. So at the same time as having kind of these very traditional sort of forms of entertainment like the bingo and the karaoke, it was also about kind of sitting down and having a discussion about local issues, but also the stuff that people felt like needed to be represented better and celebrated more. Also lots of discussion around lack of representation and often misrepresentation, and being an area that, is just kind of sidelined or ignored. So there's always voice. It's just that people felt like there's never a platform for their opinions, or they weren't being listened to. So this was Portland Street in Stoke-on-Trent. The kind of context there is that it was on the Pathfinder scheme that I think John Prescott introduced years ago. I think that's right. And so because it was kind of, this is an area that was earmarked for the Pathfinder scheme, which meant that it was going to be demolished, but lots of people refused to move. Then also the council kind of lost some sort of partnership with the developer. So half the houses were left empty, so they introduced the pound housing scheme. And then as a result of that, because there was no sort of infrastructure around this kind of regeneration scheme that was the pound houses, it was quite a kind of tense, separated sort of environment where people felt like they just weren't integrating, or they, didn't know their neighbour. The community hall was shut, the pub had been derelict for 9 years, and the corner shop was closed down as well. So very, very temporarily, this space was really, it felt really electric. And so yeah, basically that was back in 2015, and as part of the Oasis Social Club, so I sort of missed this point, as well as the landlady, we create a committee of local representatives. So they might be people representing young, old, migrant groups, whatever it might be, and also kind of council members are on that committee, so they can kind of listen to these conversations. And then we come up with a manifesto, and that manifesto in each place, Stoke, Hull and Preston, was delivered to the local council. Actually, we were at Preston railway station on platform 3, and they were quite amazing because they let us read out the manifesto on the tannoy, which was amazing. But anyway, so basically, so I've got a couple of minutes left, I think. Is that right? Okay. On a year after sort of delivering the manifesto to Stoke City Council, the council called me up and said, would I be interested in working with Anna Francis, who is a pound house owner, local resident, and also an artist, working on a project that came to the same conclusion as the Oasis Social Club. Would we be up for sort of taking over a pub temporarily? That turned into the Portland Inn project. And that's just become, I moved up to Stoke. We set up a community interest company with local residents, and we managed to negotiate the pub building. So we own the pub building for 25 years for free, and we have started, we've kind of recently finalised the architectural plans for that space. And, it's the two of us kind of that have been managing most of it are artists. At the kind of the core programme that we deliver is arts, creative, but it's also about upskilling, it's about learning, and it's really about kind of, knowing your neighbour and exchanging, and also, agency and all those things, but really about feeling like you can represent yourself. I think maybe we'll get into this later, but just, sometimes kind of community-based projects and work like this, I think, can be used and kind of misused by commissioners in order to kind of take the pressure off local councils and local services. And actually, we're really adamant that this is about putting the pressure on. And in addition to that, that everyone in that area is entitled to really good quality art and work happening on their street. So this was built by, we did a co-build with Baxendale, who had just weeks before it built a pavilion at the Venice Biennale. And we ran an architecture school. Rather than consulting people around what they wanted in the building, we just ran an architecture school. So there's sort of lots of different activity going on. But I think that's where I end. That's, sorry.
Okay, and my next speakers are Laura Robertson and Mike Pennington. And they sort of jointly run the Double Negative. So Laura Robertson is a writer, critic and editor based in Liverpool and London. She's been published in Frieze, Art Monthly, Art Review and AN, amongst others, and is the co-founder and contributing editor at the Double Negative online magazine. If you don't all know it, you should, there's on the handout there is the website link there. And she's critical writer in residence at Open Eye Gallery and part of the 2018 to 2020 MA writing cohort at Royal College of Art. Mike Pennington is a writer based in Liverpool also and the co-founder and full-time editor of the Double Negative. From 2013 to 18, he held the role of content editor at Tate Liverpool, working with the exhibitions and communications teams to deliver gallery interpretation, web content and in-house zine Compass. So please welcome Laura and Mike.
Hello. So we don't always present together, although we often have. So last year, after much umming and ahhing and hand-wringing and conversation amongst ourselves, we published on the Double Negative a strand of articles under the title Class is a Big Deal. The series set out to elucidate the problems faced by working class people when trying to access and sustain a career in the arts. We're very conscious of the fact that, although this is something that has begun to be discussed, you very rarely hear directly from people who have first-hand experience of the issues, and also the challenges, barriers and concerns that can loom so large. So some of those are the networks, opportunities, perceptions, self-image, time, confidence and money, or the lack of those things. Before we got to that point, a number of things had kind of occurred to me over the preceding few years that meant I felt more comfortable to have the conversation outside of this quite small group of like-minded friends and peers. These things, they didn't happen in isolation, but they kind of stick out as significant markers for me over the time. One of the things, and I think one of the reasons I included Tate in my bio this evening was because that's when these kind of ideas started to really coalesce for me. Although I'm not a very young man, I've kind of gone along throughout my career being conscious of being working class, but it's always been on the periphery of things. But on my first day at Liverpool, where, as Rebecca said, I worked until last year, a colleague that I'd never met before, a guy who works in front of house as a visitor assistant, he said to me that it's nice to hear another Merseyside accent in the offices. Now, at first I took this obviously as a friendly welcome, but after thinking about it for a little bit, it was quite obvious that although it was friendly and intended as such, it was also kind of loaded. The inference was that I was just one of the few of the Merseyside accents that were in the offices as opposed to the guys who worked on the desk or in the cafe or elsewhere in the building. And then a few years ago, I saw a work by an artist collective called Common Culture. That was in an exhibition at the Blue Coat in Liverpool, and it's from their series Artist Tips. So this is it here, but I'm going to read out the text because it's interesting because, for a start, one of my jobs was writing gallery interpretation text, and so they kind of frame it very much in that vibe, but this is the work in its entirety. So regional accents, which effectively means working class accents, can be problematic, but also quite attractive. If you have one, you already know the problems it can cause, but moving into the art world will heighten this even more. Middle class posh and upper class very posh, for whom privilege is the norm, populate and dominate the art world. They exude confidence, dress well, and tend to be louder and more domineering in conversation. They're also able to act as if they know each other, even if they have never met. Is this, some of you are recognising this statement.
I knew Rebecca would chuckle at that.
A lot of the best artists are working class. Now this last sentence is really interesting to me. You do get working class curators with regional accents, but they tend to be in galleries attached to libraries. Now this is the way in which we insinuate ourselves as working class people into the curatorial classes. And when I shared this artwork and spoke to colleagues about this artwork, there was a clear divide in the people who kind of laughed in a knowing way at that last sentence, and who just kind of laughed a little bit awkwardly and shrugged it off. Everyone knew what that last sentence meant, and it meant different things depending on your perspective, I guess. And one of the last things really was that last year I interviewed the artist Larry Achampong for the Double Negative. Larry is an artist whose career is very much on an upwards trajectory at the moment, and he's just a thoroughly interesting guy and a great artist. But I wanted to quote a little bit of what he said. So in that interview on the realities of trying to succeed as a working class artist, Larry said that, "I can be frank, class is such a big deal," and we'll hear more from Larry in a moment. But it's obviously this issue of class it fits into a kind of broader scheme of diversity in the arts, and how that I think all institutions, and especially the ones who understand they need real numbers through their doors, are trying to diversify the audience, because that's how they'll get different people and different bigger numbers through the doors. But I think quite often what happens is when they look around the table within those institutions, the diversity isn't really reflected in that. So it was Larry's remark and that class is a big deal that kind of gave the title and momentum for the series that we've run over the last 12 months or so on the Double Negative. In my introductions to the series, Class is a Big Deal, I started thinking about that Jarvis Cocker quote. Harder to say than I thought it would be.
Be careful.
And in one way it's kind of a really glib quote, but I think it fits in the wider context of what we're talking about. So she came, I'm going to not sing this, I'm sorry. So she came from Greece, she had a thirst for knowledge, she studied sculpture at St. Martin's College, that's where I caught her eye. So there's kind of signifiers of kind of like mobility there, not least in the fact that she ended up at St. Martin's. So writing on this quote, it was in a context of like this person's identity being revealed, but Barbara Ellen writing in The Guardian in 2015, Common People is not a song about a spoiled, condescending female, however vivid the character. The song, part poem, part manifesto, is about Cocker back then, and people like Cocker as he had been, the long-term disenfranchised and permiskint who spend their lives feeling broke, scared and hopeless without a safety net. Crucially, it's a story about a penniless, working-class student rather than a rich, slumming one. In an increasingly polarised, one-note cultural landscape, this sort of distinction seems ever more important. I mean, that song itself was important for me back in like 95 when it came out. I was about 17, I think. So I was going out a lot, and that was one of the songs that was getting played a lot, and it was the first time I'd really recognised my class being kind of referenced in a positive manner, and it was a shout out and a manifesto for us, and it was, we could all sing along to the fact that we were common people. We knew what it meant, we knew where it was coming from. So it's fair to say working class issues were at that point feeling more pressing than ever. We were planning a 2018 Double Negative Fellowship, which was for writers to be mentored by some really quite significant and famous ones, I guess. So central to our thinking was eligibility, like who should apply for it and who needs it most, who should gain access to this fellowship. We concluded that a fellowship should benefit those writers who, through no fault of their own, had hit an artificial, metaphorical ceiling in their trajectory. In a nutshell, this boiled down to people whose access to key networks was limited, not by talent, ambition, or endeavour, but by their immediate, often geographical circles. Ideally, the successful candidate would also wouldn't necessarily be able to recognise themselves in the current critical writing landscape. We condensed this further, calling for the discovery of daring new voices from the north of England. And this thinking fell in close parallel with, rather than being directly informed by the findings published by Create London and Arts Emergency and their Panicked Social Class, Taste and Inequalities in the Creative Industries report, which Dave opened this evening with. So the report looked in particular at the social class background of the workforce and how this intersects with other issues, including attitudes and values, experience of working for free, social networks and cultural tastes. The report found the percentage of people working in music, performing and visual arts with a working class background is just 18.2%. Fundamentally, this confirmed what any of us not granted a silver spoon or golden ticket conferred by privilege already knew, that things would have to change if, quotes, the idea of a fair and diverse industry, end quotes, could take hold and become a reality. So increasingly, questions of this nature are being posed and explored across the arts spectrum. In 2016, Nick S. Shuckler, the editor and author of The Good Immigrant, proposed via Twitter that someone should do a Good Immigrant-style state-of-the-nation book of essays by writers from working-class backgrounds. And quick as a flash, Liverpool-based Dead Ink Books replied, "We will publish the crap out of that," which I think really harnessed the feeling in the room and Twitter that evening. So for that independent publisher, this instinctive response was like dropping a pebble into a lake. And those resultant ripples continue to be felt, I think, as readers discover the watershed collection of essays which came to be Know Your Place. More recently, writing about what he considers a crisis of the working classes in the film industry in Sight and Sound magazine, journalist and film critic Danny Lee speaks of our living in a moment of gross inequality. He asked the question, what happens to working class talent in British cinema? The answer, I think, it's safe to assume, in that essay made for quite difficult reading. One of the contributing authors to Know Your Place, the book that was funded and published by Dead Ink Books, Kit de Wall, who has become an increasingly vocal and powerful figure on this issue, thinks that the notion of social mobility is always smacked of. How can we help you to be more like us? It seems to say that to be working class is to be a failure. Lee, meanwhile, recounts that his proposals for a project to celebrate working class figures in film to a room full of industry movers and shakers were met with bemusement. So the consensus of the great and good was that any such spotlight was unnecessary, but for Lee and de Waal, amongst others, they are at least starting to find traction and momentum in their respective fields. So the impact of these growing reports, publications and articles has been significant. And, it feels like it's just the tip of the iceberg. For many, it's led to an awakening of both consciousness and pride in the working class status. Of course, for some, this was never in question, as proved crucial, along with perseverance, talent, and perhaps anger to sticking around for long enough for a chance at success. It's also a nuanced, at times fraught issue, and conversations absolutely need to be developed. So it's great that these conversations are taking place, but I think the more conversations that occur, we can start thinking about solutions and practical solutions as well. And the world of visual art, which I occupy, where the problems outlined in the panic study are deeply felt but rarely acknowledged. This seems to yet to have truly found its voice. I wrote this article quite a long way in advance of Rebecca talking about doing this evening, and I think it's really kind of encouraging and positive to start seeing things like this crop up more and more. As the visual arts finds its voice in this area, I want to come back to Larry Achampong, who I was interviewing him about a new work. It had very little to do with class, I guess, from the outset or from the outside. But we did get onto class quite quickly, and Achampong reminded us that even on the basic level of resources, the working class person is going to have to do crazy amounts of work simply to survive, versus someone who has the privilege, who can really just wait for an opportunity. People of privilege can use their connections. I don't think that kind of conversation is opened up. As a result, you tend to have conversations with people who don't think it's anything really to do with class, it's just how hard you work, which kind of echoes some of what Dave was saying earlier about the report and meritocracies. So, after a breath, excuse me, but this is bullshit. It's something I became aware of through study, and along the way in these 10 years of hustling. How you survive gets pushed to one side, but it matters in a massive way. What does it mean for artists who can't hold down the multitudes of jobs? Just being able to see aspects of privilege that affords people time, comfort, care, safety, in comparison to those who are wondering how they will survive over the next month, or how can I make this money stretch for the project and pay the rent? Naturally, those with privilege will be able to last longer. They have the resources to continue. It's the haves and the have-nots. So I closed that article by really saying that the visual arts could do worse than look in the direction of and listen closely to what artists like Acheampong have to say. You know, people are enjoying increasingly popular exposure. So I'm going to hand over to Laura for the next part of the presentation.
As you can probably tell, we didn't time this very well because we're at 14 minutes now. So I'm just going to conclude with a few readers' views, really. I suppose the Class is a big deal series has contributed to people who continue to work, has been contributed to by people who continue to work in the arts, and also our readers, first and foremost. It's really been a way for us to give permission without making that sound kind of very, very grand. It's given permission to feel like they can talk about class issues. I think from some of the speakers tonight. Oh,
Completely lost the slides.
That's okay, Mike. I'll beat you later. I think it's given people permission to have their own voices heard in what can be a very difficult, complicated topic that can feel exhausting, boring and embarrassing to talk about. So Mike and I are both from different backgrounds, but we're both from very low income backgrounds. I'm actually from Anfield in Liverpool. So I can really relate to the things that Rebecca was saying about the exhausting limbo of regeneration, because that area's really gone through that. And you feel like if you talk about class issues, you're just kind of banging on a drum and feel like you've got a chip on your shoulder, actually. And somebody did tell us that when we asked a peer for advice on starting this series on the double negative and just kind of giving people a platform to talk about class issues. That person, that peer, who's an arts professional, just told us we had a chip on our shoulder and we should kind of move on. So it's really important for us that we just keep on talking about it and we keep on listening to people. We've had a lot of responses. Some of those responses were private over email and social media because they didn't still want to share publicly their experiences of being working class. I'm going to just share a couple of exchanges here that were posted on social media that are already made public on our Facebook page, but I think they have, I don't know, I think they just show what a deep effect class issues can have on you when they're internalized, as has already been kind of touched upon. I noticed in my teens that the only people with my accent at the gallery that I was involved with in their young people education programme were the installation team technicians. I remember asking them about their jobs and them saying, oh well, we only get to work here about every 8 weeks, and thinking that didn't seem enough as a teenager trying to make life work decisions. Also, as always identifying as working class from childhood, but then I went to uni, getting a gallery job, then one day while discussing class with someone they'd say, you're middle class, you work in an art gallery, you and everyone who works there are by definition middle class. I can relate to the comments about not feeling working class or middle class. Is there a distinction, another person said, between working class and skint? It is so fuzzy. I grew up mainly in a council flat with a first-generation immigrant single mother, lots of ASBO-style family problems. I grew up with books. I grew up with ideas and expectation to do well. My accent is more middle than working class. Always skint, cockroaches, cold beans, new stuff may have been stolen. We moved around a lot, so no fixed community to identify with. Never comfortable with any class, or is that just other people? Never accepted in either fold either. I did a first year of uni as a teenager. More recently topped it up with some self-financed open university. What class would you put me in? I think we'll finish there. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
So my final speaker is William Titley. He's an artist and is the co-founder and director of In Situ, a non-profit arts organisation based in Briarfield in Lancashire. An MMU PhD candidate, his research analyses social artistic processes from the perspective of the artist, adding to debates around what social practice is and what its limits are in its original social context. He's senior lecturer, course leader of MA Fine Art here at UCLan in Preston. So please welcome William Titley to the stage. Thank you very much.
Rather than tell you about some projects that I've already completed, which is quite a few, instead, what I want to do tonight, I want to talk about a work in progress, which is not due to be completed until July. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to show you a selection of what might look like random clips from the project. And hopefully, you can get an overview of where it started, and how things have developed, and where it might go next. Oh, yeah, that's it, isn't it? Laptop. I think my hands are that cold. It thinks my hand's dead. It's not working. So the whole project contains about 15 hours worth of video, and it's inspired by a film called Whistle Down the Wind, which was filmed in early 1961 and premiered in London just a few months later on the 20th of July. It was filmed around Pendle Hill in East Lancs, where I live, and starred Hayley Mills, Alan Bates, and several local non-acting school children, selected by the directors Brian Forbes and Richard Attenborough. So, basically, to give you a bit of an idea of what I did on the project, I invited members of the community to tell me what they could remember about the film Whistle Down the Wind. Here is June and Dorothy telling us what the film is about. I first met Dorothy when she was called Dot back in 1984. And my hand's gone dead again. Yeah, back in 1980s when she was a cleaner at a pub where I worked as a barman. She's now a local counsellor and has just had an operation on her eye to remove a cataract. She's the one on the right.
It's about a young girl that found a man hiding in her father's barn. She said, she came upon him, he said, Jesus Christ. She thought it was Jesus Christ.
All right, you get the gist, don't you? All right. This next clip, it's Jim, who's famous in Cong for his long-standing vegetarian cafe called Jim's Caff. Here he is explaining when he first saw the movie back in the 60s at our local Hippodrome Theatre, which coincidentally is directly across the road from his cafe. He's referring to two ladies sat behind him and his friend in the theatre.
It seems like they must not have been to pictures for a long time, because film starts and it's in black and white, and it's pretty silent, you know, apart from music, but first few minutes. So it trundles along. Then suddenly one of these women says, "Oh, is it not a talkie?"
This is going to take a while. I hadn't calculated in laughter. Right, this is my Uncle Bernard, my mum's brother. He's just retired from being local lollipop man, and he saw the film somewhere else.
I saw it at Grand Hotel in Nelson. I think it was 1961. Could be mistake, it might have been 62.
And this is Sharon, who grew up believing that her dad was actually in the film. Anyhow, since then, we've figured out that it's mathematically impossible for him to have been in the film, given his age. Here she is, telling us another one of his stories.
I'm quite adamant that it were local children that were
involved from like Downham, Chatburn, and I do think that they had some kind of strange way of, they just like lined them all up, the kids, and went, you, and you.
And this is Pauline, who used to be my cousin when I were at school. She's not anymore.
I reckon there must have been at least 100 plus kids in that scene.
There were some other participants as well, who also remembered lots and lots of children on Pendle Hill. And the project started to develop around those memories of the film, rather than the film itself. So on a cold Sunday morning, last November, basically I put an invite out to people to join me for a walk up Pendle Hill, inspired by one of the memories. 27 people and one dog turned up, including the little girl who played Hayley Mills' sister in the original film. There she were, in her wellies. Anyway, when we set off walking, she started to tell me about her experience of the film.
It was a practical thing, having to be up and ready for 8 o'clock in the morning to be picked up. For 10 weeks, non-stop, every day. No weekends, no nothing. And I didn't get home till tea time. And the weather was February weather, cold, wet, rainy, and never being able to not wear wellies. I had to wear them every day.
As the project developed, lots of people told me about how important Pendle Hill was to their own health and well-being. One person even said that it saved their life. Here's Cerise talking about the presence of Pendle Hill.
And it gives you sort of a thrill of being outdoors and of being mysterious. I don't know what it is about it, but it has that presence.
The original film highlighted the difference between the world of children and adults back in the 60s. Lorette, who I've known since primary school, talks about the different perceptions of the man in the barn.
I think, where kids see things, it's kind of total innocence. They don't see, the penny didn't drop that he were a hardened criminal, that he were wanted for, what I can't even remember what he were wanted for,
And June, who was in the earlier clip, remembers riding her scooter from Burnley over Pendle Hill to Downham, where they were filming in 1961. She's an avid autograph collector and remembers being told off by Richard Attenborough to keep her head down behind a dry stone wall as she walked past in the background of one of the scenes. The film really made an impact on her.
It was natural. Story. It was natural. And because it was local to our area, it got into your head and into your heart, really, Yeah.
Going back to that Sunday in November, when we marched up and down Pendle Hill, I remember the higher we went, the windier and colder and mistier it got. Hayley Mills played the eldest sibling called Kathy, and Diane, the lady who turned up in her wellies, played Nan, her younger sister. And the youngest sibling was a little boy called Charles, played by Alan Barnes, who actually lives just on the outskirts of Preston, apparently. Alan and Diane... Oh, where's the mouse gone? Don't know where the mouse is gone. Can I use arrows on here? Oh, there we go. Oh, these are better, look.
Okay.
That's better. I'll use those instead of that thing. Yeah. So Alan and Diane were selected from a local school, and many would argue that little Charles, stole the show with his cheeky one-liners and authentic northern accent. Despite being the youngest of the 3 siblings, he was the one who started to doubt the credibility of the man in the barn being Jesus.
Because he'd let his cat die. That's why he were mad about that, because the cat were dead.
Yeah.
And if it had been Jesus, he'd have saved his cat.
He would though, wouldn't he? Charles gives away his secret in front of the adults with a line that fans of the film just love to try and imitate.
Ask everybody what that line is.
Yeah.
You could have it one after the other.
Does anyone know what that line is? No? Good, because I'm going to show you. Lots of participants on the project attempted the famous line, and many of them got it wrong. Here is the youngest one, which is Finlay, my grandson, who captures some of that spirit of the film.
It's not Jesus, it's just a fella.
It's as simple as that. Meanwhile, the March of the Wellies continues, and reaching the top of the hill, the walkers begin their descent. During the initial interview stages, something began to emerge from the process, especially when I met a lady called Claire for her interview. Claire, who I used to go to circuit training with and who is now my asthma nurse at the local clinic, explained that she was expecting a call from a local policeman and that she might have to dash off halfway through the interview. Basically what had happened is her and her husband had gone down to her allotment to open it up in spring, and they found that somebody had been living in the shed. There was some food there, some mince pies and stuff, and there were also some drug paraphernalia, which is why the police were coming to take away the sharps.
Like I say, somebody's been bringing the food down here.
Right.
Just be careful.
Oh, so
There you go.
mince pies.
Yeah, somebody probably having the Christmas dinner.
Crikey, how long ago were it? So when you've been down here last? Is it
Last
a while?
time, probably, yeah.
So a winter?
Well, yeah, probably like end of last year. Because we've come to clear up and burn everything off and restart it and move it all about. And obviously somebody's been, just be careful. So...
And the thing about that is, about halfway through every interview that I did, I always asked the question, I wonder what would happen if some kids found a man in a barn today. And the participants would go on to tell me about kids today and kids back then and how things had changed and stuff. But when I actually asked Claire about it, halfway through her interview, it came out as, I wonder what would happen if some kids found a man in a shed on an allotment. And we both kind of like realised what had happened, that we were talking about this thing and it were actually really happening. So we nipped down to her allotment and filmed down there for the rest of the interview. So, to recap, I've done some interviews. I've created a memory from those interviews. And the next phase, so there's like 3 stages, was to restage the barn scene where the moment of misidentification occurred between the adult and the children. You know, where they think is Jesus. And I'd already discussed with a few of the participants about using the original barn, because it's still there, and knowing that we had Diane, one of the original actresses on board, we probably could have got the original barn to film in. But it felt like the shed was kind of crying out to be part of the project, and it was there, and Claire was happy for us to use it. So the next stage of the project, I basically invited people to come and find me on the allotment. I gave them a little map and told them to come and find me in the shed. And over 4 days in February, I allocated them all times, and about 50 people turned up, one after the other, about 30 adults and about 20 kids and one dog. And we were giving the children the task of saying, "Who are you?" and the adults the task of just replying with the phrase, "Jesus Christ." But unsurprisingly, when people came to the shed, people were curious about why we were in this shed on this allotment. So conversations started about, why we were actually sat in this shed.
So she just came down and...
She came down to open it up after winter.
Right.
Yeah. And yeah.
Everybody'd left behind. Wow.
Yeah, and so they've been sleeping down here. So. You've no chance. Somebody was so desperate that they had to sleep here. Or a general comment about...
In this particular shed?
homeless.
They didn't sleep in this shed?
Yeah, this is the shed.
Oh, this is the shed?
This is the shed.
Oh, right.
And, and had his meals cooked. We've been doing some cooking at a little camping stove, I think. So, as you can see, the project started to take on a different tone than what it started out
I think it's really sad, isn't it? When you look at the shed and how dilapidated it is and how desperate somebody must be to spend the Christmas in here.
So this is Claire and her husband, whose shed it is.
I wouldn't have a problem anybody living down here. I think the way it was done, rather than actually people actually squatting in here, that wouldn't bother me as much as finding dirt syringes and needles that somebody had used and just thrown on the floor.
And people started to offer solutions to people living in sheds and the bigger issue of homelessness. This is Norman, who I just bumped into on the street, and I used to work with Norman years ago, and he was curious about why we're taking some cameras down to their allotments.
They shouldn't really be in here, because if they set hut on fire and they're asleep, someone sets hut on fire, you're right job to get fire brigade down here.
And David and his dog starts to discuss space and homelessness.
It's not that there isn't the space. We do have the space. We just very selected on who's allowed to use that space. So, and if you try and put yourself in their position.
Yeah. So in a way, it's the system, isn't it, what's wrong? Because the space is there.
Yeah.
The system that governs that space doesn't allow those people who haven't got the space to access it.
Yeah.
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 So just to finish off, by the way, it says 18 minutes on this clock here. I've got 2 left. Just to finish off, I'll just give you a little glimpse of the kids when they did their "Who are you" bit, and the adults who said Jesus Christ.
Who are you? 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 Who are you?
And then the adults' response, because there's quite a few adults.
Jesus Christ! 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 Jesus Christ!
Jesus Christ!
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, so to finish off, that's it, I've just got me 20 minutes there. Just to finish off, this last screen, basically, there were 3 stages to the project: the interviews, the March of the Wellies and the shed. And what I'm doing is putting them all into one big feature film. I haven't finished it yet, obviously, but I will do, honest. July 2019, those are the 3 dates which I'm going to be showing the feature film. And then on the 20th, the Saturday the 20th, which is in line with when it was premiered originally in 1961, they're going to show Whistle Down the Wind. And it's at a little community cinema run by volunteers. There's only 64 seats. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday. The seats aren't open to the public yet. So if you do want a seat to go and see that, just email that address there and I'll put your name on a seat. But the seats will be going public in about June, I think. All right, that's it. Cheers.
I just want to say thank you, first of all, because it's been a really brilliant evening. It's been really, really one of the best talks I've ever been to. And I'm not just saying that because I know Rebecca. I wondered if class does have a regional, if there's a northern, southern kind of difference, or whether class is fairly universal across the country.
I think that's a great question. Who wants to start with that? I do have good opinions about this myself.
Well, I'm a southerner, so who wants to answer from a northerner's point of view?
Well, I think it's relative.
Should I start?
I think it's relative. I think, you could be fairly middle class round here, and then you could go to another location and they'll just fall about laughing at you, thinking you're working class. Do you sort of see what I mean? So I think it's a really tricky definition of who and what. Sometimes it's not about the class that you put yourself in, it's what other people put you in, how other people categorise you.
Yeah, and as a southerner, actually as a Londoner, I know that there are loads of southerners that hate me as a Londoner. So there's even that bracket as well, right? So because compared to friends that were brought up in Kent that didn't have a museum and, a shopping centre that, where I could eat roti at lunch, or, I had a very different sort of experience. So it is kind of, I don't know. And does anyone else want to? I've not really answered that, but because it's not just a northern-southern thing, right? Even amongst the southerners, there's this big divide between London and everywhere else. And having moved to Stoke-on-Trent as well, I was talking with Dave just about that being such an eye-opening experience. Actually, the sort of the shit going on Portland Street being very different to the estate where I grew up, for instance. The kind of fear that you experience in London on an estate is different to kind of the sort of the stuff going on Portland Street, which is just this constant antisocial behaviour. It's not like the fear of gangs, say. I don't know. So there's those different experiences that make it all very different.
Anybody else want to do the north-south thing?
It's slippy, isn't it?
Are you from the north, William?
Is it working? It's weird, isn't it? I sometimes get offended when people call me middle class, and I am middle class compared to, what I used to be. But I'm born and bred. I still live where I was born and bred, and I was thinking about it on the way over today. Every day, I drive through the estate where I used to live to get to work, to my middle class job as a lecturer.
Why aren't you just a working class person in a middle class profession? Why have you decided? I'm not saying
that's
you're
other
wrong.
people who
I'm not saying you're wrong.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what's the difference.
Well, to me, it's about other people, and it's about the other, because it's their response to me. At weekend, I like to feel like I'm more working class at weekend because I'm hanging around with my old friends, but they call me middle class. And I can sometimes feel myself getting really wound up by it. But I don't know. It's tricky, isn't it? Because it does seem to change depending where I am. And I do remember when I was trying to get a job as a lecturer, I used to have quite a lot of tattoos. And somebody were talking about barriers earlier and not being welcome and stuff. and I felt the need to get rid of those tattoos to be able to access academia.
Or just wear more.
Yeah. But I remember a time as well where I used to also, I mean, I do it sometimes purely just so people can understand what I'm saying, change my accent when I'm talking to certain people. Yeah, you do it as well, I've noticed.
Yeah, I've got a telephone voice.
But, you know, there's that as well, isn't there, where it depends where you are, situational almost. Yeah.
Anybody else want to answer to that one before I go roaming with the mic again?
I can give you a long academic lecture, if you like. Very quickly, it's worth thinking about class as a kind of set of categories that we use to understand how society is divided up. And usually, there's lots of debates about this, but academics will think about people's jobs. Sometimes they'll think about income, but really they'll think about occupations, because occupations are really, really important in how society is divided up and sort of stratified. I think this is slightly different from thinking about class as a category of identity. There are, you know, sort of both our who does what job and our sense of identity have a relational aspect, and class is, you know, a kind of dynamic relational characteristic for individuals and communities. But often the debates do conflate the two things. So, for example, like talking about being an academic lecturer, that's a story of having a particular social origin, so the kind of occupations your parents were doing, and then having a particular destination, being socially mobile between class origin and class destination. And for like a lot of academic research, that's, you know, quite a sort of technical category, and we describe, you know, society's kind of openness or fluidity. But obviously individuals experience this in terms of, like, you know, discussion about their accents, about you know, barriers, not feeling welcome, going into spaces that are, you know, kind of classed in particular ways. So yeah, it's a boring point, but it matters because if you want to do things that are interventions that kind of change the way cultural production is or is not welcome to particular individuals, whether it's in class terms or intersecting with gender, ethnicity, things like this, then I think it is worth kind of separating out the kind of the identity stuff from the sort of stratification stuff.
Wow. Okay. Anybody else? Or is there any more questions? Yeah. You got a question?
I just want to say thanks, first of all. It's been a really, really fascinating evening. I wanted to ask you, you know, there's your work, Dave, and the panic report, and you're right, and you're all responding to these issues. And I've done a bit of work around kind of, you know, the decolonising the museum, decolonising the curriculum, and there's this kind of move, and it seems to be developing some momentum. And I was wondering how you see, do you see this agenda growing? How do you see it going forward, really? That's a massive conundrum, but I'll just put it in the room.
I mean, it's probably more appropriate for like actual practitioners to answer, because one of the things we encounter, myself and my colleagues, is it's quite sort of easy for social science to say, you know, the museum is a middle class, highly kind of sexist and probably almost certainly institutionally racist kind of machine that's, you know, carries its Victorian legacy and blah, blah, blah. And then actually, like, people have to do this stuff, you know, like, people have to, like, turn up to work and think about curatorial choices, think about audiences, think about how do we keep this institution open? You know, we don't want it to close. So, yeah, I'm very pessimistic because that's what roughly the social science kind of points you in the direction of, particularly in terms of things work, at least as far as I can tell, for sort of 3 or 4 years, and then privileged groups get hold of them and they stop working and you need new things. But really it's more a kind of practice question. You're an artist.
Okay. Well, but that's kind of from the within the sort of limitations or conditions of an institutional sort of setup, and I guess that's why I love working outside of galleries and museums and working collaboratively, where we set the rules and we set the agenda and everyone's quite clear on what's going on, basically. I did for years work at Whitechapel Gallery, and it felt off the record. But I was quite honest about this, actually, when I was working there, running these community workshops for 3 years. sometimes it felt like the entrance that those community groups came through that gallery was through the equivalent of the luxury housing pour door. So it's kind of backdoor, you know, invisible work that's going on and needs to be made more visible. And it is, you know, often in these places, it's a kind of tick box. So yeah, this kind of, those issues always, but I don't know how anyone else is kind of challenging that.
Yeah, I suppose we started with the panic report's kind of very pessimistic outlook on what we can do to change anything. And I did feel a bit of sort of, okay, then shall we just all go home and give up moment before I got up on the stage. And I guess I understand and kind of, if I make any kind of analysis, I understand and analyze this in terms of power. And whether we're talking about race, class, gender, whatever we're talking about, it's really about who is in control, who has resources, and who makes the decisions. And currently, we are not in a position to make those decisions. However, I don't have the pessimism that the sociologists have, because I believe that it is possible to make change. And it is very difficult to make change, but I have to believe that what I'm doing can have some kind of impact. Otherwise, why would I be here? So I can't give you a kind of definitive, a definitive kind of strategy. This is how we're going to do it. But I do think that it is possible for institutions to be changed. But we have to be a lot less apologetic, a lot more vocal. I mean, I find it really fascinating that people are so reticent about discussing their discomfort in terms of class. And I suppose for me, perhaps because there is no way of hiding my racialized identity, the discussion about whether I am or am not, you know, it's kind of interesting for me to kind of listen to. Interesting is the wrong word. So I sat on a panel not so long ago where an artist who I think was born in the UK, but her parents were migrants from, I believe, Pakistan. And she asked the question, and this is about race again, about black art, whether her work would be seen as black. And she said, it's not my, I don't have a choice about whether it's seen that way. That is imposed upon me. And so whether artists want to make work that addresses those issues or not, the work will be seen in that way. And I guess a lot of my experiences has been mediated by that aspect of my identity, which is always foregrounded. Very boringly for me, actually, but that's always foregrounded. So in response to the question about class, whether it's different in the north or the south. When I think about class, I think about power, access to resources, and really it boils down to life choices. And I think that because I am, even though I am racialized as black, because I have a certain level of education, probably an enhanced circle of influence than my parents had, there's a little bit more privilege there than would have been available to my parents. And so I don't tend to deny that aspect. Whether I would call myself middle class or not, that's a little bit more of a leap. But I do, coming back to your question, I do believe it's possible for people to change their circumstances and for artists to employ their work to assist in that in whichever way feels appropriate.
I'm really aware of times if we just do a few more words and then we might. I know all the people have their hands up, I'm sorry.
I just quickly want to pick up on the last point of whether we're optimistic or pessimistic and what are the reasons for that. I mean, obviously I worked at an institution for the last 5 years who kind of, I think, are quite good at recognising their responsibility. And on the other side of that, they're good at recognising how they need to diversify in order to engage different audiences and get those audiences through the doors. I think for things to change, I think bigger institutions can help and aid that, and there can be a trickle down, but also there's people with voices on social media who can kind of call people out if those things aren't happening. So, there's a balance between that kind of cynical, well, we need to be seen to be changing, but I think there are certain people within certain organisations who understand the necessity to change, and part of that can come through kind of buying a different type of art for their collections and broadening their collections. And then the knock-on of that, I think, is by displaying those different types of artists from the collections in shows. And so it's about programme, and it's about representing audiences through programme. And once people can see themselves represented in the programme, then it's not get them through the doors and then we'll change. It's we have to change to get those people through the doors. So whether it's comes from a good place or not, and I think it's a bit of both. I think greater diversity, whether it's class or race or gender, and it should be all. I think it's all of those things. I'm cautiously optimistic, I think.
Okay. I think maybe we'll end on the optimistic bit. I know we could have kept on going, and I do apologise that we overran and didn't have time for so many questions. But I wanted to thank everybody on the panel this evening, and I hope you'll join me with thanking them one more time. See, the bar shuts in about 2.5 minutes.